Have you ever felt that, no matter how hard you try to stay calm, emotional suffering always finds a way to catch up with you? That silent pain that appears in the early morning when no one sees you. That feeling of emptiness that seems to have no clear cause. That pressure in the chest that is triggered by a memory, a word, a look. That mental exhaustion that doesn't come from what's happening to you, but from what you're still carrying inside. We have all tried to escape from suffering in some way, by distracting ourselves, ignoring it, fighting against it, blaming others, blaming ourselves, repeating positive phrases to ourselves that we don't really feel. But none of that works for a very simple reason. We're attacking the pain from the wrong place. Buddhism does not promise a life without pain. What it promises is something much more powerful. The possibility of freeing yourself from suffering even when the pain still exists. And that difference changes everything. Pain is inevitable. Suffering, no. But this oft-repeated phrase only becomes true when you understand what Buddha really wanted to reveal. Because most people think that suffering originates in what happens to them, in what others do, in the wounds they received, in life that did not turn out as they expected. But Buddha saw it with radical clarity. Suffering does not originate from what happens to you, but from the relationship your mind creates with what happens to you. Think about this. There are people who live through extremely difficult situations and yet maintain a profound calm. And there are people who experience minor discomforts and feel like they are breaking inside. The difference is not in the circumstances, it's in the mind. But this is not a message of guilt. It's not about think better and you'll stop suffering. That would be superficial, cruel, and unrealistic. What Buddha discovered is much deeper, more human, and more liberating. Suffering arises when we cling to something that life is already trying to let go of. Expectations, to stories, to identities, to unfulfilled wishes, to people who are no longer here, to a version of ourselves that no longer exists, to a future that never came, to a rigid idea of how life should be. Pain appears when something changes. But suffering arises when you resist that change. And here begins Buddha's radical solution. To stop suffering is not about avoiding pain, but about transforming the relationship you have with it. Not by pushing it, but by illuminating it. Not in fleeing, but in seeing. Not in fighting, but in understanding. Imagine you are holding a very taut rope. Pain is the rope. You can't make it disappear. It's part of life. But suffering is the act of continuing to tighten the rope, even though it's burning your hands. When you loosen up, the pain doesn't disappear immediately, but stop destroying yourself. The problem is that nobody taught us how to loosen up. We were taught to resist, to harden ourselves, to ignore, to endure, to remain silent, to pretend that nothing affects us. And without realizing it, we become our own generators of suffering. That is why this teaching is radical. Because Buddha doesn't ask you to change the world, or to change people, or to change what has already happened. It asks you for something much more realistic and powerful. It changes the way your mind interprets the experience. Not from empty theories, but from a deep understanding of how your suffering works. There is a classic scene in Buddhist texts where a disciple asks, "Master, why am I suffering so much?" And Buddha replies, "Because the arrow wounds you, but you shoot yourself with the second one. The first arrow is inevitable. Losses, disappointments, conflicts, changes, illnesses, endings. The second arrow is optional. Repetitive thoughts, guilt, attachment, resistance, projected anxiety. The internal story that tells you that you will not be able to endure it. The radical solution is to stop shooting yourself with the second arrow. And for that, the first step is to see what is really happening inside you without judgment, without fear, without disguise. See honestly. See with compassion. See with awareness, not to criticize you, but to free you. Because what you don't see controls you. What you see transforms. Suffering begins to dissolve when you are able to observe your pain without making it your identity. Without saying, I am a disaster, I am weak, I am my own wound. When you view pain as a passing phenomenon, not as a permanent sentence, you recover an inner space that you had lost years ago. That space is freedom. In that space, you can apply what comes next, a deep understanding of the origin of suffering and how you can deactivate it from within, not through force, but through wisdom. That will be the next step. Emotional suffering has a root that almost no one sees because it's hidden beneath layers of thoughts, memories, past wounds, and expectations you've been carrying for years without realizing it. Most people believe their suffering comes from the outside, from what others did, from what went wrong, from loss, betrayal, abandonment, or rejection. But Buddha observed something that forever changed how we understand human pain. Suffering doesn't originate outside. It originates in the way the mind clings to pain. That clinging is invisible, silent, automatic, but profoundly destructive. And paradoxically, it is born from fear. Not from the fear of pain, but from the fear of losing something that the mind considers essential. Identity, inner history, stability, the feeling of control. The mind clings even to pain because it fears uncertainty more than known suffering. That's why, when you remember a past wound, the pain reappears with such force. Not because the wound is still alive, but because your mind is still clinging to the story it built around it. A story that may no longer be real, but that you continue to believe as if it were happening today. The mind does this to protect you, but its protection is clumsy. He believes that if he doesn't let go of the story, he will prevent it from happening again. But all it does is keep the suffering alive much longer than necessary. Buddha described this mechanism brilliantly. We do not suffer from the pain itself, but from what the mind adds to the pain. It is that add-on, that internal narrative, that resistance, that attachment, that fear, that creates the second arrow, that multiplies the pain, that transforms a difficult situation into months or years of suffering. Imagine you are walking and you trip over a stone. That hurts. But if after stumbling, you blame yourself, your own mind berates you, you mentally relive the stumble. You imagine future stumbles, and you wonder why the same thing always happens to you. Now you are suffering over something that is already over. That extra suffering wasn't caused by the stone. Your mind created it. The suffering mind lives trapped in two times. The past, where what couldn't be changed is relived time and again. And the future, where he imagines the worst in order to try to protect himself. Meanwhile, life only exists in the present. Here, now, at this moment, it is rare that the situation is as unbearable as your mind makes you believe. Suffering thrives on the gap between what life is and what the mind says it should be. That is why Buddha taught that the origin of suffering is not in the world, but in attachment. But attachment, in its deepest teaching, is not just about being attached to people or things. It's clinging to an idea of how things should be, clinging to how you were, clinging to an ideal, clinging to a rigid identity, clinging to an emotion that should have already passed, clinging to avoiding feeling something uncomfortable. Attachment is not always desire. Sometimes it is resistance. And that resistance is the great creator of suffering. When you resist what you feel, you intensify it. When you resist what happened, you perpetuate it. When you resist what is, you lose the ability to see real solutions. Resistance is an internal war that is more exhausting than any external battle. But here comes the liberating part. Suffering does not need your resistance to disappear. He needs your understanding. Suffering dissolves when you begin to see the root of your attachment. When you realize that it's not the pain that paralyzes you, but the story you built around the pain. When you realize that it's not the loss that hurts, but the attachment to the idea that you should never have lost. When you understand that it is not rejection that destroys you, but the attachment to the idea that your worth depends on being loved. When you understand that it is not change that scares you, but the fixed idea that everything should remain the same for you to be okay. Suffering arises when your mind demands guarantees that life cannot give you. And this is where Buddha's most radical teaching comes in. Life is not the problem. Resistance to life is the problem. The mind wants to control the uncontrollable. He wants to secure the uncertain. He wants to avoid the inevitable. He wants to cling to what, by its very nature, changes. And that constant tension creates suffering. A suffering that is not in the experience, but in the interpretation. It's not in the event itself, but in the internal story. It's not about what happened, but about what your mind says should have happened. The good news is that just as the mind creates suffering, it can also stop creating it. But she won't do it by fighting against herself. He will do it when he begins to see clearly how he keeps the pain alive. Seeing is liberating. Understanding is about letting go. When you truly understand that your emotional pain is not an attack from life, but a natural movement, a wave that comes and goes, something inside you loosens. You no longer need to resist. You don't need to fight anymore. You don't need to protect yourself so much anymore. Suddenly, the suffering loses its power because the root, the attachment to what no longer is, begins to dissolve. And then the door opens to the most transformative teaching of Buddha, the possibility of seeing suffering with the eyes of conscience, not with the eyes of the wound. When you do this, suffering ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger, a teacher, a portal of liberation. That will be the next step. There comes a moment in the life of anyone who has suffered deeply when something shifts, a kind of inner weariness, a saturation of the soul, I can't take it anymore, that stems not from despair, but from clarity. It's that instant when you begin to wonder if there's another way to relate to your pain, because what you've done so far hasn't worked. That moment, though it may seem dark, is one of the most important on the spiritual path, the moment when awareness of suffering is born. And it is precisely here that Buddha's radical solution comes in. You cannot free yourself from suffering that you do not see clearly. You need to observe it. Look at him straight on, not to relive it, but to understand it. Most people run from emotional pain. They cover it up, distract themselves from it, fragment it, rationalize it, turn it into compulsive action. But all of that only fuels the suffering because it keeps it in the dark, where the mind can continue inventing stories around it. The light of awareness is the only thing that can disarm it. Buddha taught that suffering, when enlightened, loses its power, not because it disappears instantly, but because it ceases to be an invisible monster and becomes a natural phenomenon within your human experience. And observing suffering is more transformative than it sounds. Imagine this. You're in a dark room and you feel like something is following you. Your heart races, your breathing changes, your thoughts race. But when you turn on the light, you realize it wasn't a monster, but a shadow cast by something small. The shadow wasn't real. Yes, fear. Light does not eliminate the object, but it eliminates confusion. The same applies to suffering. When you look at it, the shadow disappears. When you see it clearly, it stops controlling you. But how do you observe suffering that burns you from the inside, that suffocates you, that paralyzes you, or that hurts at the slightest touch? With a very particular type of care. Care without identification. It means looking at what you feel without turning it into me, without saying, I'm broken, this defines me, this is who I am. It means seeing pain as an internal movement, not as your identity. There is suffering in me, not I am suffering. There is sadness in me, not I am sad. There is anxiety in me, not I am anxious. This small linguistic, philosophical, and spiritual change is gigantic. When you observe your pain in the third person, your consciousness becomes slightly detached from it. That space is liberation. That space is clarity. That space is the beginning of the end of suffering. But to observe suffering, you need courage. The courage to be with yourself. The courage not to run away. The courage not to cover up the wound. The courage to remain silent about what hurts. Many believe that observing suffering will make them weaker, when in reality it makes them stronger, because it connects you with the part of yourself that has never been harmed. The observing party does not suffer. The observing part does not break. The observing party does not need protection. Buddha called it the inner witness. It is the consciousness that sees without being affected. It's the sky behind the storm. The clouds may be dense, dark, violent, but the sky remains intact behind them. Observing suffering is remembering that you are the sky, not the cloud. Once you can see your pain without making it your identity, something begins to silently transform. Suffering loses intensity, it loses strength, it loses credibility, because it ceases to be a story and becomes pure sensation. And the sensations, however intense they may be, pass. They begin, reach their peak, decline, and disappear. But we suffer because we get caught up in the story, not in the feeling. The feeling doesn't last that long. The story can last for years. When you observe suffering from a place of awareness, you discover something profoundly liberating. The most painful emotion cannot destroy you. It can move you, it can pressure you, it can make you uncomfortable, but it cannot finish you off. What breaks you is not the emotion, it's your resistance to feeling it. What torments you is not the pain, it's the story you tell yourself about it. And when you understand this, a sense of space within the pain emerges for the first time. As if you suddenly could breathe a little better. As if there were a centimeter of distance between you and your wound. As if something inside you loosened after years of tension. That space is the gateway to liberation. Because where there is room, wisdom can enter. And the wisdom of Buddha does not stop at observing. It leads you to take a more radical and powerful step. The next step is to understand the true nature of emotional pain, something that has never been explained to you. That it is not an enemy, it is not a punishment, it is not a failure, it is not a sign of weakness. It's a message, it's an invitation. It is a sign that something inside you is ready to be seen, acknowledged, and transformed. When you understand what pain is trying to show you, your relationship with it changes. You stop fearing it. You stop running away. You stop carrying it as a burden, and you begin to integrate it as part of your growth. The radical teaching of Buddha is not to eliminate pain, but to transform it into understanding, into clarity, into inner freedom. And that is precisely what we will explore in the next part. There's a point on the journey that completely transforms how you see your own pain. When you understand that emotional suffering isn't just a reaction, but a message. a message you never learned to read. A message your mind has interpreted as a threat, when in reality, it's a form of wisdom waiting to be heard. Buddha taught something extraordinary. Emotional pain doesn't arise to destroy you, but to awaken the consciousness you have forgotten. The pain you try to avoid is, in reality, the key that unlocks the door to a deeper understanding of yourself. This is what makes his method radical. It doesn't invite you to eliminate pain. It doesn't invite you to anesthetize it. It doesn't invite you to ignore it. He invites you to listen to it. Listening to pain is a revolutionary act. It goes against everything we were taught. It goes against our survival instinct. It goes against our emotional programming. From a young age, we learned that pain should be avoided. That pain is a sign that something is wrong. That feeling pain is a failure. That crying is a weakness. That feeling too much is dangerous. But Buddha saw exactly the opposite. Suffering arises because we have not learned to relate to pain consciously. Pain itself is not the enemy. Ignorance about its nature is. Imagine that inside you, there is a room that you never enter. Whenever something hurts you, you push that emotion into that room and close the door. But what's inside doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and the more you ignore it, the stronger it becomes. Not because he wants to hurt you, but because he wants to be seen. Ignored emotions don't die. They turn into suffering. Buddha taught that suffering is accumulated pain. Pain that went unheard. Pain that went unattended. Pain that was not consciously felt. Pain that you turned into history and then into identity. When an emotion is not acknowledged, it becomes rigid. When it is recognized, it becomes fluid. And what flows transforms. The Buddhist method invites you to do something that most people have never done. Stop and enter that inner room. There, where your fears, your wounds, your losses, your unfulfilled expectations, your guilt, your grief, your shame reside. Not to punish you, but to release what has been trapped for years. When you enter that room consciously, something happens that almost no one expects. The pain changes shape. He ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger. He stops being a monster and becomes a wounded child. It ceases to be a burden and becomes a door. It ceases to be a punishment and becomes a path. There is nothing more transformative than looking at pain without running away from it, without trial. No story. Fearless. Buddha explained that emotional pain is, in essence, a sign of internal misalignment. It's your deepest self's way of letting you know that something inside you is disconnected. Your heart's thoughts, your action of your value, your past from your present, your true nature behind the mask you wear. Pain arises when you distance yourself from yourself. Suffering arises when you don't listen to that signal. Every painful emotion carries a specific message. Sadness shows you what you need to let go of. Anguish shows you where you are trapped. Anxiety shows you that your mind is living in a time that doesn't exist. Guilt shows you that you are still carrying a story that may no longer be yours. Shame reveals a part of yourself that needs acceptance. Fear shows you your disconnection from the present. Anger shows you a boundary that was violated. Loneliness reveals a broken bond with yourself. When you start listening to these messages, the pain stops feeling chaotic. Stop feeling like an out-of-control enemy. It becomes clear, intelligible, understandable. And what you understand, you stop fearing. This understanding doesn't eliminate pain instantly, but it eliminates suffering, which is what truly consumes you. Suffering is the noise around pain. When the noise disappears, you can work with the emotion from clarity, not from despair. There is a moment, while you are listening to your own pain, when compassion is born. Not compassion towards others, but towards yourself. A deep compassion that says, Now I understand why you hurt so much. You're not doing badly, you're just carrying too much weight. It's not your fault you feel this way. You don't need to hide it. You don't need to toughen up. You don't need to carry this weight alone. Compassion is not pity, it's recognition. It is presence. It is the energy that dissolves suffering because it is the only one capable of embracing pain without rejecting it. Buddha saw that compassion is the true medicine for human suffering. Pain is not cured with force. Pain is not cured by denial. Pain is not cured with control. Pain is healed with compassion. And compassion arises when you stop fighting with your emotions and start listening to what they want to show you. Here, the great transformation takes place. When you listen to the message of pain, pain stops needing to scream. It softens, it opens, it moves, and finally, he is freed. But this process is not complete without the next step, the practice of letting go. Letting go is not forgetting. Letting go is not giving up on feeling. Letting go is not about forcing yourself to overcome something. Letting go, in the Buddhist sense, is allowing what has already completed its cycle to stop occupying space within you. And that will be the next step in the journey. There's a word that appears again and again in the Buddha's teachings, but it's almost always misunderstood. Letting go. For many, letting go means forgetting, surrendering, ceasing to feel, releasing something that still hurts, cutting it off completely without looking back. But that's not the Buddhist view. Letting go, in its deepest sense, has nothing to do with forcing or forgetting. Letting go means ceasing to cling to that which causes you suffering, even when you continue to feel pain. It is an internal act, not an external one. It is a liberation, not an abandonment. People often confuse letting go with losing. They believe that if they let go, they will be left empty. They believe that if they let go, they are giving credence to the person who hurt them. They believe that if they let go, they will show weakness. They believe that if they let go, it means that what they experienced wasn't important. But that vision is born of fear, not wisdom. Buddha taught that letting go doesn't take anything away from you. It gives you back to yourself. Because what hurts you is not what happened, but how you continue to cling to it internally. You don't let go of what you experienced. You let go of the tension with which you continue to hold on to it. You let go of the story that imprisons you. You let go of the interpretation that hurts you. You release the resistance that exhausts you. You let go of the expectation that was never fulfilled. You let go of the identity that no longer fits you. Letting go is not forgetting. Letting go is remembering without losing yourself. It's about looking at the past without being dragged down by it. It's about acknowledging what happened without letting it become your prison. Imagine you are holding a rope that is tied to something that is already gone. A relationship, an idea, a dream, a version of yourself. Your hand is squeezing tightly. So strong it hurts. You can't change what's at the end of the rope. You can't bring it back. You can't rewrite it. But you can open your hand. That's letting go. It doesn't change what happened. Change your relationship with what happened. And that simple gesture, easing the pressure, loosening the rope, letting your hand breathe, profoundly transforms your experience of pain. Not because the memory disappears, but because the internal struggle disappears. Buddha doesn't ask you to force anything. It doesn't ask you to force yourself to let go. It doesn't ask you to convince yourself of something you don't feel. Buddhist teaching is more realistic, gentler, more humane. Let what is no longer there stop consuming your energy. Suffering arises when you continue to hold on to something that life has already let go of. A person, a stage, an idea, an expectation. a role, a dream. Not out of malice, but because your mind is afraid of what will happen if you open your hand. The mind believes that if it lets go, it will lose its identity. But the truth is that when you let go, you find yourself again. There is something profoundly liberating about understanding that you don't have to let go all at once. You don't have to perform a heroic act. You don't have to overcome anything overnight. Letting go is a gradual process, like loosening your fingers one by one. First, you let go of the blame. Then you release the resistance. Then you tell yourself the story you were telling yourself. Then you drop the demand that what happened be different. And finally, you let go of the need to change what you cannot change. The pain may remain for a while longer, but without the strain of attachment, it no longer destroys you. Breathe. Little by little it will move, shift, transform, like a wave that finally finds the shore. Letting go requires trust. Trust in life, but above all, trust in yourself. Confidence that you will be able to stand on your own without what you were clinging to. Confidence that there is something more for you. Trust that your pain is not the end of the road, but a sign that something new is trying to be born. And here lies one of the most difficult and at the same time most beautiful truths of Buddhism. Many things hurt because they no longer fit within the person you are becoming. They don't hurt like punishment. They hurt like a transition, like an old skin peeling off, like an old form that breaks down to make room for another. Suffering arises when you try to keep alive a version of yourself that is already ready to die. And letting go means accompanying that process instead of resisting it. But letting go is not just an emotional act. It is also a mental act. You need to let go of repetitive thoughts, those circular stories that fuel suffering day after day. If I had done this, why did that happen to me? I shouldn't have allowed it. I won't be able to stand it. This defines me. These thoughts are the real prison. The emotion hurts, but it passes. The thought of her brings her back to life again and again. Letting go means ceasing to repeat history, not because it doesn't matter, but because it's no longer useful to you. And when you start to let the story unfold, something extraordinary happens. The possibility of feeling without suffering. The possibility of pain moving without you breaking down. The possibility of breathing within what previously suffocated you. Letting go creates space. And in that space, peace enters. Not an artificial peace, but a deep, real, mature peace that does not depend on things being different. A peace that comes from ceasing to fight against what already is. But there is still a deeper step. Learning to stay in the present without falling back into the traps of the mind, because your mind will try to lead you back to attachment again and again. And that will be the next stage of the journey. There is a crucial point in the process of liberation from suffering, learning to remain in the present without being swept away by the mind. You may have observed your pain, understood its message, even begun to let go. But if your mind keeps taking you to the past or pushing you toward the future, suffering will find a way to return. Therefore, for Buddha, the final key, the key that closes the circle, is the deep practice of presence. Being present does not mean not thinking about anything. It doesn't mean emptying your mind. It doesn't mean escaping from the world. Being present means fully inhabiting the only moment that truly exists. This one. Your mind can project hundreds of stories, thousands of possibilities, countless scenarios, but your body only lives here. And when your consciousness returns to the body, to the now, to the moment you are going through, suffering loses much of its power, because suffering needs two things to survive: a story from the past or a fear of the future. The present is the ground where suffering cannot take root. This is not a pretty phrase. It is a profound observation of how the human mind works. If you were to close your eyes right now and ask yourself, what is happening to me right now, exactly right now? You would discover that most of the time, nothing unbearable is happening. Everything unbearable is in your head. What your mind revived, what your mind imagines, what your mind fears losing, what your mind wants to control. In the present, the pain may be there. Yes, the emotion may be there. The feeling may be there. But they are rarely as violent as the story that the mind constructs around them. The present does not eliminate pain, but it does eliminate unnecessary suffering that arises from mental narratives. Buddha described presence as the inner island, the safe place where you can take refuge even when everything outside seems chaotic. An island where the waves of thought arrive but do not sweep you away, where the wind of emotion blows but doesn't knock you down, where the noise of the world sounds but doesn't confuse you. Presence is not passivity, it is power, because only in presence can you clearly see what is happening inside you. Only in the presence of others can you hear your intuition. Only in presence can you stop reacting compulsively. Only in the presence of others can you make decisions that truly set you free. But the mind has enormous inertia. She's used to running. She is used to anticipating, remembering, and analyzing. That's why, when you try to be present, at first it rebels. It wants to drag you back into the story, the drama, the worry. He doesn't do it to hurt you, but because he believes that's how he protects you. The problem is that the mind does not distinguish between protection and suffering. It takes you back to the past so that you don't forget what hurt you, and to the future so that it doesn't happen to you again. But by doing that, it keeps you in a state of constant pain. Presence is the act of saying to the mind, I don't need to go back to be sure. I don't need to anticipate the future to feel peace. I'm here. And being here is something physical, not just mental. You can use your breathing. You can use the feeling of your feet on the ground. You can use the air temperature. You can use your heartbeat. Any present sensation can become an anchor. Breathing is the most powerful of all because it is always with you and always happens in the present. When you breathe consciously, you are not in the past or the future. You are in your body, in your life, in this moment. And that contact with the present moment is what deactivates suffering. Here's a truth that changes everything. Presence does not eliminate your emotions. It eliminates your identification with them. When you are present, you can feel sadness without becoming sadness. You can feel anxious without becoming anxious. You can feel fear without becoming fear. Emotions become waves, and you become the ocean. They move, you remain. In the presence of others, pain ceases to be an enemy and becomes an experience that you can bear. It doesn't break you down. It doesn't control you. It doesn't define you. Just flow. And when you can hold the pain without running away, without resisting, without interpreting it, something even more transformative happens. The pain begins to teach you who you really are. It shows you your wounds, yes, but also your strength. It shows you your vulnerability, but also your ability to sustain it. It shows you your fears, but also your courage. The present is the place where you discover that you are not your story. You are not your wound. You are not your past. You are the consciousness that observes all of that. You are the presence that sustains all of that. You are the space where all of that happens. And from that understanding, true liberation is born. If you are not your suffering, then you can let it go. If you are not your story, then you can write a new one. If you are not your pain, then you can transform it. If you are not your mind, then you can choose not to believe every thought it produces. Presence gives you back the power that suffering had taken from you. But something is still missing, the culmination of Buddha's radical teaching. The profound understanding that liberation doesn't come simply from observing, understanding, letting go, or being present. Liberation comes when you can integrate all of this into your daily life, your relationships, your way of thinking, acting, and responding to the world. That integration will be the final stage of this journey. At this point, you have already seen what Buddha discovered with a clarity that forever changed the history of the human mind. That pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. Pain is an experience, but suffering is a mental process. Pain may visit you, but you hold on to the suffering. Pain comes and goes, but suffering remains because you sustain it. And that behind that habit, behind that emotional inertia, behind that weight you have carried for so many years, there is no weakness. There is ignorance. When you begin to understand your suffering, something breaks. But it's not you. The illusion is shattered. The illusion that you are your wound. The illusion that what happened to you defines your future. The illusion that you cannot change. The illusion that your pain is permanent. The illusion that you are broken. The illusion that there is no way out. And just when that illusion shatters, an inner space appears that you may have forgotten. A space of freedom. Freedom to feel without losing yourself. Freedom to remember without destroying yourself. Freedom to let go without fear. Freedom to choose how to respond. Freedom to stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. Freedom to breathe inside things that used to suffocate you. Freedom to look at your own life without the filter of pain. But this freedom is not theoretical. It's something that is experienced in daily practice. Because the transformation that Buddha proposes does not happen in an isolated monastery, but in the places where you truly suffer. In your relationships, in your thoughts, in your memories, in your insecurities, in your expectations, in your fears, in your daily life. Buddha's radical solution is not an escape. It's an inner revolution. And that revolution begins when you start applying the 4 essential movements we've covered so far. See, understand, let go, and return to the present. But now you need to integrate them. You need to make them your way of life. You need them to be more than just theory. They need to be your way of finding yourself. Integration begins when you start observing your mind throughout the day, not just when there is pain. When you recognize how small internal tensions arise when talking to someone, when thinking about something pending, when remembering something old. When you notice how your mind wants to race towards the past or the future, even in moments of calm. When you notice how judgment, comparison, and self-demand are activated. Not to criticize you, but to understand you. Every time you see a pattern without judging it, you are weakening its power. Every time you notice a thought without identifying with it, you are undoing years of conditioning. Every time you breathe instead of reacting, you are dismantling a chain of suffering that has been active for years. Every time you choose the present, you are breaking the cycle that kept you trapped in stories that no longer serve you. Integration also happens when you apply compassion to yourself in small moments. When you make a mistake, when you feel fear, when something you thought you'd overcome hurts, when your mind drags you back in. You no longer need to attack yourself. You no longer need to demand perfection from yourself. You no longer need to be your own enemy. Compassion restores the humanity you had lost towards yourself. And when compassion enters, suffering recedes. Not because the emotion disappears, but because it stops feeling like a punishment and becomes a natural process. Integration also manifests itself when you let go not only of intense emotions, but also of smaller things that steal your peace. The desire to always be right, the need to control, the obsession with predicting everything, resistance to inevitable changes, the dramatic narrative with which your mind overinterprets what happens. Releasing these small burdens creates a space that was previously completely occupied. And in that space, clarity begins to emerge. Clarity is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to see without distortion. It is knowing how to discern what comes from the ego and what comes from the heart, what is born from wounds and what is born from wisdom, what you need to let go of and what you need to protect, what you need to change and what you need to accept, what is real and what is an idea you are telling yourself. With clarity, even difficult emotions become manageable. The sadness becomes gentle. The anxiety loses its edge. Anxiety turns into movement. Fear becomes a sign that you are growing up. Loneliness becomes a call to reconnect with yourself. And here, the deepest understanding of the Buddha's method emerges. Suffering loses its power when you learn to be with yourself. When you no longer abandon yourself emotionally. When you stop running away every time something hurts. When you stop fighting against yourself. When you become your own refuge. Take refuge in yourself, Buddha taught. Be your own island. Be your own light. And this is more than poetry. It is true liberation. Knowing that you can hold on even when you feel pain. Knowing that you can remain present even when something hurts you. Knowing that you can breathe within fear. Knowing that you can allow pain to pass through you without breaking. Because now you understand. Pain doesn't destroy you. What destroys you is resistance. And you no longer need to resist. Suffering begins to dissolve when you accept life as it is, not as your mind demands it to be. When you accept your emotions as messages, not as threats. When you accept your story as a path, not as a sentence. When you accept your pain as part of your growth, not as a failure. And then, for the first time, you feel something akin to peace. A peace that doesn't come from everything being okay on the outside, but from you being okay on the inside. A peace that does not depend on control, but on understanding. A peace that does not depend on running away, but on being present. That is Buddha's radical solution. It's not magic. It's not theory. It is not empty optimism. It is a profound change in the way you relate to your own human experience. And when you integrate it, you discover something you may not have felt for too long. Life is lighter when you don't resist it. You are freer when you don't cling on. And your heart is stronger than you imagined.